Hey everyone, tonight we're going to talk about how long people lived in the Middle Ages, a time when just getting up in the morning was an accomplishment. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is coming to see us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights. To get that soft background noise, you could turn on a fan. Get ready for our journey together tonight. This sentence would win the award for the most misunderstood statistic in medieval history without any competition. People in the Middle Ages only lived to be about 30. This line has become so well known that it is now part of folklore. People who have never stopped to think about what an average is often quote it confidently, dramatically, and almost always incorrectly. This number does not mean that adults in the Middle Ages woke up on their 30th birthday, looked in the mirror, and said, "Ah, yes, the time has come." "Ah, yes, the time has come," they said to themselves in the mirror before gently falling into the nearest ditch. What it really means is that fate made childhood into an obstacle course on a bad day. Life expectancy is not a timer that counts down, and infant and child mortality completely destroyed the averages of the Middle Ages. When a lot of kids die young, like they did in the Middle Ages, the math doesn't help at all. The average goes down, even though the adults who live on tend to live a long time, lives that won't change. Think of a village where half of the kids never grow up. The survivors may live into their 50s or 60s, long enough to complain about their joints, criticize the young people, and insist that things were better back in my day. But the average still looks bad because the early deaths pull the number down like an anchor tied to a sinking boat. This is why the average lifespan in the Middle Ages looks so bad on paper. Giving birth was dangerous. Being a baby was dangerous. There were a lot of chances to get unlucky as a child. There weren't any. There were no vaccines, antibiotics, or germ theory, and no one told you not to drink that. A fever was a big deal. It was a deal. A small cut wasn't a big deal. It could have ended your career for the rest of your life. There weren't a lot of weak adults in the Middle Ages. There were adults there who had already made it through the worst part. People who made it through childhood were not weak. They had been through a lot of battles. That famous number does tell us something important, but not what. People believe it shows us that people didn't live very long in the Middle Ages. It was a world where survival was hard, uneven, and very unfair. Honestly, that's a very old-fashioned way to do statistics. If life expectancy in the Middle Ages was a math problem, birth was where the math tried to kill you right away. It wasn't easy to be born in the Middle Ages. It was a high-risk event that involved pain, uncertainty, and no one who really knew what they were doing. Giving birth was risky for everyone. Mothers had to go through labor without painkillers, antiseptics, or the comfort of having someone there who knew about infections. Midwives used their experience, prayer, and a mix of herbal remedies that could help or make things worse, but they were committed to them. There were no hospitals like we have today, no emergency surgery, and no clean tools. If things got complicated, the answer was often spiritual support and hoping for the best. Respected good intentions. The baby came into a world that immediately tested its will to live. People started getting sick, cold, and not getting enough food right away. The first few days were very important. A lot of babies didn't live long enough to get a real name, not because parents didn't care, but because giving someone a name who might not live through the week was hard on the heart. Birth records from the Middle Ages show how hard life was back then. Sometimes people rushed to get baptized, but not because they were scared. From experience, people were aware of the odds. They lived with them. Mothers who lived through childbirth weren't always safe either. Infection, bleeding, and other problems could kill people days later, even after the baby had been born, and everyone thought the danger was over. To stay alive, you needed both luck and strength. Repetition is what makes this so bad. Women never had to deal with this risk. They had to deal with it over and over. It was common for women to have more than one pregnancy. Every one was a new chance. Another talk with fate that no one wanted to have. People kept having kids, though, not because they were careless, but because they needed to stay alive. High death rates meant that there had to be a lot of births. Families adjusted even when that meant living with a lot of uncertainty. People in the Middle Ages didn't think that birth meant life. They hoped for it carefully, quietly, and with the emotional control of people who had learned that being too hopeful could be bad. In the Middle Ages, being born didn't mean you were safe. It was the start of a long talk. If you were born in the Middle Ages and lived, congratulations, you had officially finished the tutorial. Sadly, the real game began right after that, and it was much harder. Childhood was not a safe, innocent time in life. It was the most dangerous time in history, and it showed no mercy at all. Children in the Middle Ages were in danger all the time. There was always disease. People practiced hygiene, but they didn't know why it was important. Germs were hard to see, strange, and seemed very dedicated to their jobs. A simple fever could turn deadly, and no one knew when it would. Doctors didn't check for symptoms. They were sure of their guesses. Another common threat was accidents. Kids worked early in the morning. They played with animals, tools, opened fires, rivers, wells, and carts without any safety rules at all. It wasn't uncommon for people to fall into things. It was a common event in childhood, and without modern medical. Without care, injuries that seem small today could end a life. Food didn't help. A lot of kids ate a lot of grains and not a lot of other foods. This was possible in good years. It made people weaker and less able to fight off illness in bad years. Hunger made everything worse, even staying alive. Parents were aware of this. They loved and held back as they watched the kids grow up. Everyone quietly and carefully celebrated each milestone as if happiness itself could bring bad luck. The more time a child, the longer they lived, the better their chances got. But no one ever really relaxed. This is where modern misunderstandings start. We think of childhood in the Middle Ages as being emotionally cold. It wasn't. It was careful with feelings. Loving deeply while knowing you might lose someone was a way to stay alive. People learned to have hope in small amounts. And yet, even with all that, a lot of kids did make it. People who made it through the most dangerous early years became stronger, tougher, and incredibly resilient. By the time they were teenagers, their chances of survival had gotten better. A lot. You had already beaten the hardest level without even knowing it at that point. People in the Middle Ages didn't care about kids, so childhood wasn't short. It was short because no one cared. You didn't just grow up, you earned it when you became an adult. A lot of people still believe the false idea that medieval parents didn't love their kids because so many of them died. This is usually how the logic works. If loss was common, then attachment must not have been strong. This idea sounds cool and emotionally neat, and totally wrong. Parents in the Middle Ages loved their kids very much. We know this from letters, wills, prayers, church records, and graves. The parents were very sad. They mourned in public and in private. They wrote about their kids. When they could, they paid for memorials. They didn't just shrug and move on like robots made of straw and theology who don't care about anything. What parents did in the Middle Ages was not emotional detachment. It was about managing your feelings. You don't stop loving when death is common. You stop making assumptions. You learn to love while keeping just enough distance so that you can get through the grief if the worst happens. This wasn't being cold, it was something that happened. Parents took their time celebrating milestones. The first year of a child's life was important. Getting to early childhood was important. It was important to make it through winter. Each stage brought a little more relief and a little more hope. Sometimes naming ceremonies were put off, not because parents didn't care, but because naming someone who might not live through the month was hard on their hearts. It was grief. Making a budget, you can see this warning all over the place. Parents prayed all the time. They used charms. They did what people said to do. They tried everything they could find, even if it wasn't very helpful or even very good. This wasn't a lack of knowledge. It was a mix of love and desperation. And when kids died, parents didn't just sit there and take it. They mourned in a way that is all too familiar to us. Medieval records often mention tears, prayers, guilt, anger, and silence. It hurt just as much to lose then as it does now. It hurts now. The difference was in how often, not how they felt. This myth is ironic because parents in the Middle Ages were so good at adapting. They kept going even after losing. They kept working, raising families, and living. People today confuse resilience with apathy, but resilience doesn't mean not having love. When love has to go on, this is what it looks like. Parents in the Middle Ages loved their kids completely, but they couldn't be sure that everything would turn out well. Most people don't know this plot twist. Listen, if you made it through childhood in the Middle Ages, your life expectancy went up a lot without anyone noticing. Not magically. This was still the Middle Ages, but it was enough to completely change the saying that famous people only live to 30. You had already made it through the most dangerous parts of medieval life by the time you were a teenager. At that point, you weren't always taking chances with nature anymore. You were still playing the game, but the odds had stopped being openly against you. A lot. Adults in the Middle Ages lived into their 50s. A lot of them made it to their 60s. Some people even lived into their 70s, and at that point, the village as a whole decided that you were either blessed, cursed, or secretly immortal. It wasn't common for people to get old, but it did happen. And when it did, it had power. People respected, asked for advice from, and sometimes blamed elders for everything that went wrong, which is still how it is today. This is where modern misunderstandings really fall apart. In the Middle Ages, people didn't live in a place where everyone died young. Many people died young there, but those who lived there often lived much longer than expected. Life expectancy statistics hide that difference by turning complicated human experiences into a single, misleading number. When people became adults, they got into routines. They worked, got married, had kids, complained about their aches and pains, and had strong opinions about how lazy the younger generation had become. In other words, being an adult looked the same, but with fewer safety nets and more medieval things. Effects. This doesn't mean that life is now safe. There was always disease, accidents, and hardship, but surviving wasn't a surprise every day anymore. You were very strong if you made it to adulthood, even by medieval standards. People in the Middle Ages didn't think they would live forever, so keep that in mind. They didn't make plans for retirement. They planned for the future by passing on their knowledge, land, skills, and traditions to the next generation while they could. Just because you made it through childhood didn't mean you would live a long time. But it made one possible, and in a world where survival was never guaranteed, that chance meant everything. Just because you lived through childhood in the Middle Ages didn't mean you had beaten disease. It meant that the disease had agreed to stop running at you and instead walk calmly behind you for the rest of your life. Illness didn't just come by once in a while. It was background noise that was always there, always looking for a chance. People in the Middle Ages lived very close to animals, garbage, smoke, and each other. When sanitation was more of a suggestion than a system, towns smelled the way you would expect them to. There was no guarantee of clean water. Food went bad quickly, and no one knew why any of this mattered, which is a very important detail. Disease didn't make sense without the germ theory. It seemed like sickness was random and very personal. One person lived through a fever, one did not. One family lost a lot of people in one season. Another one came out unscathed, which made everyone else suspicious right away. Plagues came out of nowhere and left a mess. Some were local, some were regional, some changed history, and even when there weren't any big outbreaks, smaller illnesses kept coming back. Every day, people got sick with respiratory infections, stomach bugs, parasites, and skin infections. You were fighting something if you were alive. The medical responses were enthusiastic, but wrong. Doctors used old ideas about how the body's humors worked. Bloodletting, purging, sweating, and strong words of hope were all part of the treatments. Patients sometimes got better even though they were getting treatment. They sometimes got better because they stopped getting it. Both results were seen as successes by the doctors. The fact that the disease spread so quickly made it even more dangerous. A mild illness could get worse in just a few days. There was no idea of keeping an eye on symptoms over time. If you got worse, it happened quickly. Families often didn't know that someone was in big trouble until it was too late. Even tough adults were at risk. Hard work made bodies weaker. Bad nutrition made things worse. Resistance, cold winters, and bad harvests made it easy for diseases to spread. To survive, you needed luck, resilience, and exhaustion all at once. But people changed. They learned how to recognize patterns. They saw that people got sick at certain times of the year. They stayed away from other people when they could. They hoped, prayed, cleaned, and rested. It turns out that hope is a resource that can be used again and again. Life in the Middle Ages wasn't all about disease, but it did shape every expectation. You lived a long time, but it wasn't because you got better. It was because it missed you just the right amount. In the Middle Ages, disease was always around, but medicine was always close by, doing its best. And by best, we mean running on vibes, tradition, and a lot of self-assurance. Medieval medicine wasn't useless, but it was very hopeful about how little proof it needed. Doctors thought that blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were the four humors that controlled the body. They thought that imbalance caused illness. The obvious answer was to take out something, usually blood, and a lot of it. If you were already weak, good for you. You were about to become a lesson. In the Middle Ages, bloodletting was like turning something off and on again. Headache, bloodletting, fever, bleeding. Are you sad? Most likely bloodletting. It worked sometimes and didn't work other times. Doctors wrote down both results as proof that the method worked. Herbal medicines also had a part to play. Some of them really worked. Willow bark eased pain. Honey was good for cuts and scrapes. Garlic had antimicrobial characteristics. Sadly, these helpful treatments were mixed in with advice about astrology, prayers, and drugs that people who wanted to live longer probably shouldn't have taken. There was surgery, but it was brave like standing in front of a charging bull. No painkillers, no antiseptics, and no idea what infection is. Surgeons had to work quickly and with strength, and the patients had to be able to scream loud enough to stay awake. The chances of survival were different. Midwives and healers from the community often had more practical knowledge than doctors who had been trained in the past. They learned from doing things instead of reading old books. But even they were limited by what people of their time knew, which wasn't much. Confidence was the most dangerous thing about medieval medicine. Doctors had a lot of faith in what they did. Patients trusted them because they didn't have many other options besides prayer or doing nothing. Sometimes not doing anything was the safest thing to do, but it was hard to explain when a man in robes was holding a knife and looking hopeful. And yet, medicine did change over time. It took a long time for knowledge to build up. There were fewer mistakes made again. Even when explanations were wrong, observations were still important. Most people in medieval times did not live because of medicine. but it changed how people thought about sickness, survival, and hope. In a world where nothing is certain, even guessing was better than being quiet. What you ate in the Middle Ages didn't just change your mood or waistline, it actively negotiated with how long you would live. One of the most powerful forces was diet. It worked quietly, slowly, and without caring about fairness to shape survival. Most peasants ate the same things over and over again, and they were all beige. Bread was the main source of calories every day. It was usually dark, coarse, and full of whatever grains were still around that year. Add some porridge, some vegetables now and then, and maybe some cheese. Congratulations, you had enough food to keep working, but not enough to do well. This diet worked in good years. Bodies changed. People lived in a bad. Everything fell apart over the years. Hunger came from bad harvests. When people were hungry, their immune systems got weaker. Because their immune systems were weak, diseases could now easily get in. Famine rarely killed by itself. It came with friends. There was meat, but the poor didn't eat it often. It showed up on holidays, special occasions, or when something had already died and needed to be taken care of right away. Not having enough protein didn't kill people right away, but it did make recovery harder and illness more dangerous, which slowly shortened lives. Kids were the most at risk. Kids' bodies were growing, but they didn't always get the nutrients they needed. Malnutrition made kids grow more slowly, made their bones weaker, and made it harder for them to fight off infections. A lot of kids lived, but the cost of living showed up later in life. The rich, on the other hand, ate better, with more variety, more protein, and more calories, not necessarily healthier food by today's standards, but enough to give their bodies a better chance. This didn't make the nobles live forever. They still got sick, but it pushed the numbers in their favor. The seasons were important. Diets in the winter were worse. There was no more fresh food. There weren't many ways to keep things fresh. People ate what they had, even if it wasn't the best. It was common to have moldy bread, watered down beer, and questionable leftovers. It didn't help to complain. It didn't help to starve faster either. The effects of the medieval diet were especially sad because they were so hard to see. No one died suddenly from eating poorly. People got weaker over time instead. They got better more slowly. They got sick less often. Their lives didn't end with a bang. Instead, they slowly lost their strength. What people ate didn't determine who lived or died on any given day. It decided who had a chance of winning when things went wrong. And things always went wrong in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, if disease and diet didn't kill you right away, work was always waiting for you. You didn't work for 8 hours in the Middle Ages and then complain about it online. It was always happening, physically, over and over again, and you couldn't stop unless you were about to die, and even then, you might not be able to. Peasants worked long hours, starting early and ending late. Plowing, planting, harvesting, hauling, threshing, repairing tools, fixing fences, and doing it all over again the next year were all part of farming. There were no ergonomic tools, no safety rules, and no idea that you should lift with your legs. You were supposed to let your back figure it out. Injuries happened a lot and built up over time. A. The twisted an ankle never got better. A hurt shoulder stayed hurt. A bad fall might not kill you right away, but it would slowly make everything you could do afterward less possible. And when your body failed, so did your ability to live. Most of the time, work didn't kill people in a big way. It killed them slowly by making them tired, weak, and worn out. A body that was weak was more likely to get sick. A person who was tired didn't heal well. A worker who was hurt became dependent, which was risky. In a world where there are no safety nets, children also worked early, not because their parents were mean, but because they had to in order to stay alive. By the time a person became an adult, their body had already been through a lot of stress for decades. This meant that even people who lived to be old often did so with long-term pain, limited movement, and a lot of experience with suffering. People who worked with their hands and in trades did a little better. Their work was still hard, but not as hard as working on a farm full time. This difference is clear in records. Some jobs had longer lives on average, not because they were safer, but because they weren't as harmful over time. The funny thing is that hard work was seen as a good thing in the culture. Work was good. Being lazy was suspicious. People were proud of their ability to endure, even when it meant they lived shorter lives. You could complain, but you couldn't quit. Work didn't usually kill people in one day. It changed bodies year after year until something else finished the job. And if you lived to be old, every ache was a record of survival that is written right into your bones. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was already unfair, but for women, the difficulty level was raised without anyone asking for permission. Women had to deal with almost all of the same dangers as men, like disease, hunger, hard work, and accidents. The only difference was that they had to deal with childbirth, which was a constant threat. People in the Middle Ages did not think of pregnancy as a medical problem. People thought of it as an unavoidable part of life that everyone hoped would go well. There were. There were no ultrasounds, no emergency procedures, and no clear idea of what went wrong when it did. There were a lot of problems. The results were not certain. Being hopeful was required. Giving birth was dangerous. Labor could go on for days. There was always a chance of bleeding, infection, or injury. If something went wrong, the only help was from midwives who did their best with their experience, prayers, and whatever tools they had. That was enough sometimes. A lot of the time, it wasn't. And the danger didn't stop when the baby was born. Infections that happened after birth quietly took lives days or weeks later. Women who looked fine all of a sudden weren't. Families were happy about the birth, but soon after, they had to plan a funeral. Joy in the Middle Ages didn't last long. Repetition made this especially cruel. Women did not have this risk once. They had to deal with it over and over. Having more than one baby was common because survival depended on numbers. High birth rates were needed because many children died. Every pregnancy was another roll of the dice. Dice with the same body that was already weak from work, malnutrition, and labor. Even so, a lot of women lived a long time. Records show that women lived to be older, ran households, worked in the fields, raised children, and became important members of their families and communities. Living didn't mean having it easy. It meant having to be responsible and strong at the same time. Men often died from violence or work related stress. Women often died because of biology, which doesn't care about fairness at all. How long people live show this imbalance, even though the stories behind them are rarely told. Being a woman in the Middle Ages didn't mean you would live less long, but it did mean you would take more risks. And every year that passed was not just a stroke of luck. It was quiet strength in a world that always needed it. Even when disease wasn't a problem and food was plentiful, there was always one more threat in the background of medieval life. Violence, not the constant chaos of war, but the kind of instability that was always there, just close enough to matter. War, raids, fights, and crime didn't happen all the time, but they were always possible, like a storm cloud that everyone pretended not to see. Most people in the Middle Ages weren't soldiers, but they lived in a world where fights broke out often and took a long time to settle. Armies went through the countryside, not around it. When they did, peasants paid the price. Crops were destroyed, livestock went missing, and villages were looted in a planned way. During wartime, survival had less to do with being brave and more to do with not being seen. Young men were the most at risk. They were the ones who were forced into service, drafted, or caught in fighting, whether they wanted to be or not. This made life expectancy even more uneven. A single campaign could thin out whole age groups, leaving behind gaps that statistics quietly filled in. There was also violence in the community. Fights over land, inheritance, or honor could end in death. The police were not always the same. Justice depended a lot on who you were, where you lived, and whether someone important cared enough to step in. Lived, and if someone important cared enough to step in. For a lot of people, staying out of fights was as important to their survival as farming. Accidents and violence between people came together easily. There were taverns, tools, animals, and weapons all close to each other. A bad fight, alcohol, and sharp objects could quickly end a life. These deaths weren't happening all the time, but they were happening often enough to be important. Violence was especially dangerous because it added to everything else. Hunger made it weaker, bodies. The disease made recovery harder. An injury that could be survived today could be deadly. Then a wound wasn't just an injury. It was a way for the infection to finish what it had started. But life in the Middle Ages wasn't always a bloodbath. Most of the time, most people lived normal lives. They worked, fought, made up, and put up with each other. Expectations were shaped by violence, not by daily life. Life expectancy didn't go down because violence was everywhere. It went down because it was so harsh when it did happen. Peace was never in the Middle Ages. Forever. You enjoyed it while it lasted, but you were careful about it. In the Middle Ages, living a long life didn't just depend on luck, strength, or avoiding strange fevers. It also depended a lot on something you couldn't change, who you were born to. Long before anyone could make good choices, Social class quietly changed the odds. Peasants were more likely to be in danger. Hard work, bad food, being outside all the time, and living in close quarters all worked together to cut lives short. If you were poor, your body paid for survival every day. You didn't get any time off. You didn't get to do less work when you were hurt. You worked until you couldn't anymore, and then you worked some more. Nobles had different lives. They had better meals. They slept in homes that were warmer. They had jobs that weren't as physically demanding. They had servants who took on risk for them. This wasn't because nobles were smarter or stronger. It was because their bodies weren't always being worn down by the act of living. This doesn't mean that nobles were safe, not at all. Disease didn't care about titles. Plagues were happy to go through castles. Everyone was affected by a lack of medical knowledge, and nobles often died in wars, tournaments, and grand political plans. Privilege raised the chances, but not the results. Clergy members usually lived longer than both peasants and nobles. They didn't have to do as much hard work, had more stable access to food, and got help from others. Monasteries served as early social safety nets, regular meals, a place to stay, and help when sick made a big difference. It turns out that having a routine and getting enough sleep are good for survival. Life in the city was somewhere in the middle. Cities were both dangerous and full of opportunities. Better access to food and trade was a good thing, but it was also bad because of overcrowding, trash, and disease. Depending on timing and luck, living in a city could either add years to your life or take them away. Class didn't mean you would live. It changed the odds a little bit. A peasant could live for a long time. A noble could die young, but comfort was important in terms of numbers. Less physical strain was important. Consistent nutrition was important. People in the Middle Ages did not all have the same life expectancy. It was given out based on how much work it was. And those who could least avoid them had to carry the heaviest loads. One of the strangest ideas people have about the Middle Ages is that old people didn't exist. It was as if the only people who lived in medieval villages were young people, tired people, and people who had just died. In reality, old age is absolutely was there. It just didn't spread out evenly or nicely. In a medieval village, you would often see old people, men and women with bent backs, weathered faces, and joints that hurt more than the church bells. These people had lived through disease, hunger, war, childbirth, and years of hard work. They weren't out of the ordinary. They lived through it. It wasn't biology that made old age rare. It was about getting in. Access to food, stability, and a body that hadn't been completely destroyed by work or illness. Been completely destroyed by work or being sick over and over again. People who lived to be old often did so because they were either very lucky or lived lives that were good for their bodies. Being old gave you status. People looked up to elders, asked them for advice, and sometimes blamed them for things like bad harvests or bad behavior by young people. They were memories of the past. They remembered past wars, famines, and mistakes, which meant that they were either respected for their wisdom or ignored because they were right. That being said, old age wasn't kind. There was no retirement, no pensions, and no medical help to make you feel better. Getting older meant pain. It meant less movement. It meant relying on family and friends. If that help didn't work, it didn't take long for survival to become uncertain. People in the Middle Ages didn't think about old age the same way we do. Not everyone thought they would get there. People thought of it as a bonus stage, a blessing, and sometimes even a burden. Long life meant you had outlived many of your peers, which made them feel both proud and alone. People have been known to live into their 60s and 70s, and sometimes even longer. These people did not make the low life expectancy numbers any less valid. They made them clear. They showed what could happen if you survived early risks. People in the Middle Ages didn't live long, so old age wasn't uncommon. It was rare because not many people got the chance, and those who did, they literally and historically carried an entire era on their backs. At this point, it should be clear that life expectancy in the Middle Ages has not been very good at explaining how people lived during that time. There is a number. It is correct in a technical sense, and most of the time, people get it wrong in the most sure way possible. Life expectancy is not a guarantee. It's not a guess. There isn't a countdown clock above your head. It is an average, which is a mathematical way of putting together very different experiences. And in the Middle Ages, those experiences were so different that they were almost funny. When half of all kids die, young, averages fall apart. Tragedy pulls them down long before they even have a chance to be an adult. The number sounds shocking, but it doesn't tell you much unless you know what went into it. When modern readers hear that life expectancy is low, they often think of a society where everyone lived short, unhappy lives. That picture looks neat and dramatic. It's also wrong. People in the Middle Ages didn't think they would die at a certain age. They were ready for the unknown. They thought danger. They thought that survival was something you had to work for every year, not something that was automatically given to you. This difference is important. People made different plans for their lives. They didn't think about the future in terms of decades. They thought in terms of seasons, harvests, and surviving winters. Kids are big enough to help. Each year was an achievement, not a step toward a set goal. Lifespan, the longest age a person can live, has stayed surprisingly stable throughout history. The number of people who reaged changed a lot. People in the Middle Ages were sorted out early and harshly. Modern society filters much later. The ceiling didn't move a lot. The floor did. Statistics hide the truth about people. They put grief, luck, endurance, and resilience into one number and act like that number tells the whole story. No, it doesn't. It never has. Life expectancy tells us how safe a society is, not how weak its people are. People in the Middle Ages were not weaker biologically. They were too much for the environment. This knowledge alters our perception of the Middle Ages, not as a time when people lived short lives, but as a time when people took big risks and staying alive was an accomplishment that deserved respect. If you look at life expectancy In the Middle Ages, without the misleading averages, a more accurate picture starts to emerge. People in the Middle Ages didn't die at a certain age all the time, and they knew how dangerous their world was. They knew that every day. It was not assumed that they would survive. It was talked about. Life in the Middle Ages was influenced less by a multitude and more by being around. Exposure to illness, hunger, violence, childbirth, accidents, and fatigue. Each of these risks took lives away in an uneven, early, and frequent way. Some people were taken away right away. Others lived long enough to become the quiet pillars of their neighborhoods. The difference was not often moral, smart, or fair. It was based on the situation. People in the Middle Ages didn't expect to live long. They wanted ones that worked. A good year meant that everyone had enough food, no one got really sick, and everyone was still alive by winter. The end. That worked out. It didn't make sense to plan decades ahead when the next season was never certain. But people still loved deeply. They had kids. They taught others how to do things. They told tales. They were unhappy with the weather. They fought with their neighbors. They were very familiar with both weddings and funerals, which is very modern. Life was not meaningless because the odds were shorter. If anything, they made it more urgent. The harshness of life expectancy in the Middle Ages was not that people died young. It was unexpected that death came. Some lives were short and unfair. Some were long and full of experience. The averages made those stories look neat and wrong. It was important when someone got old. Elders were living proof that it was possible to last. They carried memory, perspective, and sometimes wisdom that came from losing something. Seeing them made everyone else remember that survival was not impossible, but it was not certain. So the real lesson is not that medieval. Life was brief, it was weak, and in that weakness, people changed. They worked, put up with things, and kept going, not because they didn't understand danger, but because living has always been a way to fight against it. Life expectancy shows us how hard life is. It doesn't tell us how human the people who lived there were. People in the Middle Ages were very stubbornly human until the end. Nefertari was born when Egypt was getting ready for one of its strongest times. Even though we don't know where she came from, but we do know that she was raised very differently from most women her age. This girl wasn't just trained to look royal in processions or to sit quietly behind a throne. Nefertari got an education only the rich could afford from a young age: language, writing, religious symbols, and how to act in court. She could read and write hieroglyphs fluently, which was a skill that even many high-ranking officials didn't have. In a culture where words were sacred and writing was seen as literacy was power. Her name, Nefertari Meretmut, which means the most beautiful of them all and beloved of the goddess Mut, had religious and political significance. In ancient Egypt, beauty wasn't just about how someone looked on the outside. It meant peace, intelligence, moral balance, and God's favor. To be beautiful was to be a part of Mart, the order of the universe itself. Nefertari was linked to this ideal from the beginning, and it was made to stand for stability in a world ruled by gods and kings. Being raised in high class circles, she would have seen how power really worked in Egypt. She saw how temples affected politics, how marriage could seal alliances, and how queens could change policy without giving orders. These lessons were important. Egypt was not ruled solely by violence. It was also ruled by symbols, rituals, and careful actions. Nefertari learned when to speak and when to stay quiet and when it was safe to do so. She was also raised with a lot of religious training. She turned into very familiar with the most important gods and goddesses, especially those that are connected to queenship, motherhood, and protection. This spiritual fluency later let her take on sacred roles that priests and kings usually filled without any trouble. She wasn't just there for rituals, she knew what they meant. When Nefertari joined the royal family, she was already more than just a possible wife. She was ready to become a living representation of Egypt. She was smart, calm, and knew her worth. In a court where Nefertari stood out not because she wanted to be noticed, but because she naturally drew attention to herself. Her life was already leading her to something great long before she became the great royal wife. Nefertari didn't just become a queen when she married Ramses. She married a god who was still alive. People in ancient Egypt didn't think of the pharaoh as a symbolic ruler or a king who was favored by the gods. He was a god, the earthly form of Horus and the chosen son of Ra. To stand. To stand next to such a person, you needed more than just looks or a noble birth. It needed complete control over image, ritual, and self-control. Nefertari quickly showed that she was up to the job. Ramses was still young when they got married. He was ambitious and wanted to be better than every other ruler who came before him. He knew how important spectacle was from the start of his reign, and Nefertari became a key part of that vision. Unlike many royal wives, she was not hidden in the background. Instead, she was very visible in inscriptions, reliefs, and temple scenes that were often the same size as the king, a rare and intentional decision. In Egyptian art, size was the same as importance. Nefertari's fame made a strong statement. This queen was important. Their marriage was also about politics. Egypt was going through a time of fierce competition with other countries, especially the Hittite Empire. At home, stability was just as important as military strength abroad. Nefertari exuded calm authority, bolstering Ramses' legitimacy and showcasing the royal household as peaceful and blessed by God. They all represented order, balance, and continuity, the very rules that kept the universe from falling apart. But this was not a partnership where one person did nothing. There is proof that Ramses really trusted her judgment. Nefertari's presence is clear, unlike many queens whose influence is only implied. She plays religious roles that are usually only for kings, such as making offerings to gods and taking part in sacred rituals, and acting as a link between the divine and human worlds. This visibility was not by chance. It showed how capable she was and how much faith people had in her. By royal standards, their emotional connection seems to be very strong. Ramses would later have many children with many wives, but Nefertari was his main queen and the most important wife for many years. He uses language and inscriptions that goes beyond formula to show his admiration and devotion to her. In a court where power and hierarchy matter, Nefertari got something rare, lasting favor. Nefertari took on one of the most dangerous jobs in Egypt when she married Ramses. She didn't disappear into the throne's shadow, even though she was surrounded by ambition, ritual, and expectation. Instead, she helped shape its image and, without saying so, its power. Nefertari was not only good at ceremonies, she was also very good at diplomacy, which made her much more than just a traditional consort. Egypt was very involved in world politics during Ramses' time. The Near East was a weak chessboard where different powers fought for control, alliances changed all the time, and war was always a possibility. Words, when used correctly, could stop people from killing each other. The king and Nefertari both knew this. Her most impressive diplomatic role is shown by letters that have survived from the Hittite court, especially from Pudu-Hipa, the powerful queen of the Hittite Empire. These letters weren't official greetings written by scribes and signed with royal names. They were personal, friendly, and politically correct. Nefertitari called Pudu-Hipa my sister, which is a title only given to the highest-ranking rulers. This wasn't a compliment. It was a sign of status. Nefertari helped keep things stable after years of fighting between Egypt and the Hittites by talking to them. Peace was fragile after decades of fighting, including the famous Battle of Kadesh. Kings could sign treaties, but trust was built through relationships. Nefertari helped keep that trust. She sent gifts of gold, fine linen, and other expensive things to show that she was friendly and to show that Egypt was rich. Egypt's wealth grew as a result of the linen, luxury goods, and other gifts, which also showed goodwill. Every gesture had a meaning. Every word was carefully picked. What makes this so special is that she worked in a political space that was mostly male. While male diplomats talked about borders and armies, Nefertari used softer but just as powerful means. Language of kinship, religious symbols, and respect for each other. She knew that diplomacy wasn't just about being in charge. It was also about how people saw things. If peace seemed honorable, so it was more likely to last. Her ability to read and write gave her a big edge. She could read letters from foreign correspondents, understand the subtleties, and answer without having to rely on other people. Because she was so direct, Ramsay could trust her with sensitive matters. It also made her famous outside of Egypt, which helped her reputation grow throughout the ancient world. Nefertari is not passive, submissive, or decorative in these letters. She is sure of herself, can speak clearly, and on purpose. A queen who knows how powerful she is. She helped keep the empire stable at its height by using diplomacy instead of orders. While armies protected Egypt's borders, Nefertari kept the peace in a quiet, effective, and very smart way. In ancient Egypt, being a queen was not just a job, it was also a religious duty. Nefertari got her power from both her religion and her marriage, and she knew this better than most. People thought the queen should be a living example of divine femininity on earth, a link between gods and people. Nefertari didn't just play this part, she lived in it completely. She was very close to Isis, the goddess who was the wife, mother, and protector of kings. Isis was not a goddess who sat back and did nothing. She was a planner, a magician, and a bringer of order. The royal court was making a strong point by putting Nefertari next to Isis in temple reliefs and inscriptions. This queen wasn't just helpful, she was necessary. Isis brought Osiris back to life and kept Horus safe. Nefertari did the same thing, guarded Ramses and Egypt's future. Nefertari often showed up to do religious ceremonies that were usually only done by pharaohs. She made offerings to important gods, took part in temple ceremonies, and was shown interacting directly with the gods instead of standing behind her husband. These pictures were made on purpose. Religion in Egypt was not solely a matter of personal belief, that was statecraft. A queen who could confidently work in sacred space made the whole dynasty seem more real. Her job as God's wife and lady of the two lands had real power. Temples were economic engines that controlled land, labor, and money. Nefertari had an indirect impact on resources and religious networks all over Egypt by being a part of temple life. Priests did not think she was pretty. They thought she was sent by God. People also saw her in a certain way because of this sacred power. People who weren't royalty might never see the queen in person, but they did see her picture carved into stone, painted on walls, and prayed to. Nefertari turned into a motherly presence in a huge, scary empire that was both familiar and comforting. Religious power, on the other hand, lasted longer than physical presence. Nefertari's divine connections stayed strong even as the years went by and other wives moved into Ramses' house. It is hard to get rid of sacred images. By deeply rooting herself in Egypt's religious worldview, she made sure that her power could not be easily taken away. Nefertari's strength at the time wasn't loud or violent. It was ritualized, symbolic, and long-lasting. She made queenship into something that would last forever through religion. Not only was she the king's wife, but she was also a necessary part of the order of the universe. Nefertari's place at court stayed special as the years went by, but time was never neutral in the home of Ramses II. The king would live for decades and have many children with many wives. But Nefertari's position as the great royal wife was something that no other queen could easily take over. Her influence was not predicated on novelty or youth, but rather on trust cultivated through years of gong, tong, tong, z, ye, shu, he, z, ren. Royal inscriptions show something unusual about ancient kingship. Love that seems real instead of scripted. Ramsay talked about Nefertari with respect, focusing on her wisdom and grace, not just her looks. This was important in a system where queens could lose their power if they lost favor. Nefertari stayed important long after the first few years of the reign. Her Her power didn't go from being seen all the time. It came from the base she had already built. Being a mother made this position even stronger. Nefertari had several children with Ramsay, including princes and princesses who were important in both court and religious life. Through them, her power reached the next generation. In Egypt, legacy was the most important thing. It was like living forever, to be remembered through one's children before death. But even a beloved queen could not escape the truth about time. As Nefertari got older, she showed up in official records less and less often, not erasure, but transition. Egypt's visual culture often focused on perfect moments instead of the decline of time. Her pictures stayed young, godly, and calm, as if it were frozen in time. What makes this time in her life so special is that there was no competition or shame, even though real life went on. There is no proof that politics has fallen, gone into exile, or been replaced through scandal. Instead, Nefertari seems to slowly fade from daily court life while still having symbolic power. That alone shows that they put a lot of thought into it and have a lot of respect. Her legacy was already safe by the time she stopped being in the public eye. She had changed the way people thought about queenship during Ramsay's time, had an effect on diplomacy, and made religion the basis of royal power. Younger queens might live in the same palace, but none of them had her story. Nefertari's story in these later years is not one of loss, but of strength. She did what most people never did in an empire that was obsessed with permanence. A legacy that will last through time, favor that will last through change, and relevance that will last through silence. Nefertari's tomb made it clear beyond a doubt what her status was. People now think that the burial place of this Egyptian queen is the most beautiful one ever made. The Valley of the Queens has a tomb cube of 66. This tomb doesn't show any signs of humility or tradition. Every wall, every color and shape says that this woman was special. Many royal tombs use size to show power, but Nefertari's burial site focuses on refinement, symbolism, and closeness to the divine. The walls are covered in bright paintings that are so well preserved that they look almost new. As the queen travels through the afterlife, she is surrounded by deep blues, glowing reds, and bright golds. She is not shown as a passive soul waiting for judgment. Instead, she is shown as an active participant, talking to gods, getting advice, and moving confidently toward forever. The way she is shown is what stands out the most. Nefertari looks calm, dignified, and radiant in her fine white linen clothes and crown of divine favor. The gods see her as an equal, not as a servant. This is an important part of Egyptian belief. How someone was shown in death showed how they were supposed to live forever. Nefertari was not supposed to die. She was supposed to be there. The religious texts showed there are passages from books that were only for kings on the walls, which makes her status even higher. These decorations were not chosen at random. They needed permission, resources, and a religious reason. Giving such texts to a queen meant that her soul deserved the same care and protection as a pharaoh's. The location of her tomb was also important. The Valley of the Queens was more than just a place to bury people. It was a holy place that had to do with rebirth and motherhood from God. The royal court put Nefertari there to connect her forever with rebirth and the renewal of the universe. The tomb's perfection is ironic because it adds to the mystery. Even though it was beautiful, her mom was never found there. It is not clear if her remains were moved for safety or if they were stolen by tomb robbers long ago. But maybe that absence makes her story even more interesting. Nefertari doesn't want to be normal in life or death. Her grave is more than just a place to rest. It is a statement carved in stone and color that the queen was meant to be remembered for all time. Nefertari did not become a myth or an idea after she died. Instead, she went into a carefully planned eternity that was meant to reflect the power she had in life. Ancient Egyptians thought that the afterlife wasn't a reward, but a continuation, a second life that required preparation, knowledge, and God's approval. Nefertari got all three. Inside her tomb, she is shown standing in front of Osiris over and over again, not as a scared soul waiting for, not as someone who is scared or unsure, but as someone who is calm and sure of themselves. This way of seeing things is important. Osiris was the final word on death, rebirth, and renewal. To be portrayed calmly in his presence signified moral excellence and spiritual preparedness. People don't judge Nefertari too harshly. She is welcome. She is also very close to Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, music, and keeping the dead safe. Hathor often shows up to help Nefertari, giving her comfort and a safe way to get there. This pairing has a lot of meaning. Hathor was strong as well as caring, a god who could either protect or destroy. Walking next to her meant being blessed by God. The pictures of the afterlife show movement. Instead of stillness, Nefertari is depicted as walking, talking, gesturing, and interacting. This shows that people thought the soul was still alive and aware. Eternal life did not entail perpetual repose. It was a never-ending part of the cosmic order. The queen's knowledge of holy texts and rituals made sure she would never get lost or confused in this. Trip. The most surprising thing is that there is no fear. Many tombs have pictures that are supposed to keep demons, traps, and destruction from getting to them. These threats are not very strong in Nefertari's tomb. Her path is clear, lit up, and safe. This visual confidence implies that her spiritual standing was deemed indisputable. This picture also helped the living remember. Anyone who went into the tomb would see not a weak person, but a soul that had won. In Egypt, remembering, long-lasting life. If you were remembered correctly, you would live forever. Nefertari's scenes in the afterlife made sure that people would remember her as calm, smart, and accepted by God. So her last change is now complete. She is no longer just the queen of Egypt or the wife of a king. She becomes something more, a permanent part of holy cosmology. Nefertari still has power, respect, and presence even after she dies. Her eternity was not quiet. It was planned. The story of Nefertari doesn't end with her burial. It starts in a lot of ways there. People in ancient Egypt were very interested in memory. They thought that if they were remembered, they would still exist, names spoken, pictures kept, and stories told again. These were the tools that made people live forever. By that standard, Nefertari was more successful than almost any other royal woman of her time. But there is an unusual contradiction in her legacy. A strong presence with no physical presence. Her grave is still in amazing shape. Her picture was clear and alive, but her body isn't there. There is no coffin left. There is no mummy in the chambers that were made for her to rest in for all time. This lack of information has led to centuries of speculation. Did they move her body to keep it safe from tomb robbers? Was it lost in the past? Or was it quietly moved to another place where time took away its identity? We still don't know the truth. This mystery has only made her legend stronger, which is strange. Nefertari is more than just a person from history. She turns into an idea. She lacked corporeal remnants to tether her to mortality. She exists mostly through art, symbols, and memories. Her painted face, which is calm and sure, has survived stone, dynasty, and empire. For hundreds of years after the New Kingdom fell, her name was lost to the world, buried in sand and silence. But when her tomb was found again, it sparked interest right away. Scholars, artists, and historians saw something that doesn't happen very often. A woman whose power was not implied, but was openly displayed on every wall. Unlike many queens who are only known through their husbands, Nefertari speaks for herself through pictures and writing. Her legacy also changed how people think about women in ancient Egypt today. She contests the oversimplified notion that queens were merely ornamental or devoid of power. Instead, she shows that beauty and ritual can go along with intelligence, education, and diplomacy. Her life makes us rethink how power worked, not just through armies and laws, but also through symbols, relationships, and belief. People remember Nefertari today not just as the wife of a great king, but also as a person who was independent and elegant. Museums make copies of her pictures. Researchers look at her titles. People who come to see her tomb are often amazed by it and say it feels more personal than grand. A place made to honor a person, not just a job. In the end, Nefertari got what the ancient Egyptians wanted most. Even though her body was gone, her name lived on. In Egypt, that meant she really lived forever. Take away the gold, the hieroglyphs, and the pictures of gods. And what is left is a woman who knew more about power than most kings. Nefertari's greatness was not a fluke, nor was it given to her just because she married someone. It was built up over time with intelligence, discipline, and a natural understanding of how Egypt worked at its most basic level. In her world, balance was what made authority work. People who were too ambitious were seen as suspicious, and people who were too quiet were seen as erasure. Nefertari walked this narrow path very carefully. She didn't question the king's power, but she made the meaning bigger, of queenship so completely that it could never go back to being something less. The idea that the queen was just for show was no longer true after her. Her legacy will last because of how consistent it is, not because of one thing she did. Her public image, religious role, diplomatic voice, and honorary preparation all tell the same story. There is no conflict between her life and the way she was portrayed after her death. That kind of unity is hard to find in any time, whether it's now or in the past. It suggests that the woman deliberately defined herself, knowing exactly what she wanted: to be remembered and to make sure that memory was set in stone. Nefertari also had good timing. She lived during the time when the empire was at its most confident, and Egypt had the means to make people seem almost like gods. But others lived during that time, and not many left such a clear mark. The difference is in the agency. Nefertari didn't wait for an explanation. She showed up. Her story reminds us that power doesn't always make a big deal out of itself. It writes letters instead of laws at times. It sometimes shows up in rituals instead of battles. Sometimes it stays alive, not by conquering, but by staying the same. Nefertari learned how to use these quieter forms of influence and outlasted many others whose names were carved deeper but meant less. Today, she is in a special place between history and respect. People study her, admire her, and still don't know everything about her. That mystery is not a problem with her legacy. That's what makes it strong. The ancient Egyptians thought that the dead should stay away from a holy line that kept their power safe. Nefertari is still far enough away to be respected. She was more than just the wife of a great king and the owner of a beautiful tomb. She was a great example of how intelligence, restraint, and symbolism could change how people remember an empire, and that might be her biggest accomplishment. A group of archaeologists opened an ancient site high in the Alai Mountains, where the ground freezes hard in the winter and the landscape is mostly quiet. This wasn't a skeleton that had been broken up into pieces. This was a person, someone you could see, touch, and feel. The shock only got worse after the ice was gone. Her skin was covered in dark, complicated tattoos that twisted into animal shapes and flowing lines. These were not scratches or faded marks for decoration. They were carefully planned and placed with skill and meaning. The patterns hinted at who someone was, what they believed, and what their status was. No matter who she was important. The burial itself was very special. She had put to rest with care, not quickly. Her position, the things around her, and the work that went into making such a room in a hostile area all showed how important it was. This was not the grave of a normal nomad. This person was worth protecting from time, animals, and forgetting. The discovery was haunting not only because it was preserved, but also because it was so close. Distance is something that archaeologists often have to deal with. Artifacts that show centuries. Here, that distance disappeared. The Ice Maiden faced the modern world head on. To face. Her body still had the shape of life. Her face was calm, composed, and almost purposeful. She was still there, even after death. The news of the discovery spread quickly, not because of gold or weapons, but because she was a real person. She asked a question that archaeology doesn't often answer so clearly. Who was she? A priestess, a leader, a healer, and a fighter. The ice kept her body, but not her story. But the message was still clear, even without words. This woman had lived a meaningful life in a world that has long since been erased. Memory in writing, the frozen ground had kept her safe for more than 2,000 years. And now she wanted people to understand her. To understand the Ice Maiden, you need to know about the Scythians, who lived in a huge, mobile society. They didn't build cities, raise temples, or write down their own history. They didn't leave any written records to explain themselves. Instead, they rode horses, took their money with them, and relied on memory, ritual, and movement instead of stone and permanence. The Scythian world was made up of huge grasslands and mountain passes. It was a place where wind, cold, and distance were important. To stay alive here, you had to be tough and able to change. Communities followed seasonal routes, herding animals, trading with people from far away, and always defending themselves. This was not a life of ease. It was a life shaped by movement and being ready. In this nomadic structure, women didn't have to stay quiet at home. Archaeology has shown that Saiyan women rode horses, hunted, and sometimes even fought. Cases fought. Burials show that women were buried with weapons, tools, and signs of power. In this landscape, the idea that only men have power doesn't hold. In a world where everyone relied on skill and endurance, status came after ability. Religion and faith were very important. The Scythians thought that the natural world was full of living things that needed to be respected and worked with. The sky, mountains, and animals all had meaning. Ritual specialists, shamans, healers, or spiritual mediators led communities. Through sickness, death, and change, tattooing, clothing, and burial practices were not for show. They were words. This context is very important when looking at the Ice Maiden. Her intricate tattoos, meticulous burial, and separation from conventional graves imply a role that transcended ordinary existence. In Saiyan society, someone who put so much effort into death had power in life, either spiritually, socially, or both. The Saiyans were also at a crossroads. They traded with civilizations far away, taking in new things while staying true to themselves. They made something that was uniquely theirs by mixing Persian goods, Chinese silks, and local customs. This mix made a culture that was both tough and elegant, able to make art as well as fight. The Ice Maiden didn't come from another world. She came from this one. She was part of a group that valued strength, symbols, and the ability to bounce back. For them, keeping her body safe wasn't just about being sad. It was about continuity, making sure that her presence, no matter what it stood for, would last. After death, the tattoos on the Ice Maiden's skin were the most interesting thing that the ice revealed. They weren't just random marks or simple signs. There were detailed, moving pictures of animals, deer with twisted antlers, mythical beasts on the move, and predators chasing each other forever. The ink was still dark and deliberate, as if it had just been drawn, even after more than 2,000 years. Tattoos weren't a trend in the Scythian world. They were who they were. These pictures worked as biography written on the body itself. Each figure had many meanings that were connected to ancestry, belief, and their place in the community. Animals were not chosen at random. They stood for spiritual powers, guardian spirits, and personal strength. Wearing them all the time meant that you were with those forces. The placement of the tattoos is just as important as what they say. They ran along her arms, shoulders, and hands, which are all visible places that people can see in everyday life and during rituals. This means that her body was not hidden or limited, but shown on purpose. She was someone whose presence in public spaces meant something. The tattoos turned her skin into a living symbol. The level of skill involved makes this even more interesting. Tattooing in the past was painful, risky, and permanent. There was a real chance of getting sick. To do such work, you needed stamina and a reason to do it. No one would easily agree to it. This alone shows status. These were not marks that other people put on them. They were deserved. Scholars think that the tattoos may have had a religious purpose even after death. Saiyan people thought that the soul lived on after death and that identity needed to be kept. The tattoos made sure that the Ice Maiden would be known in the spirit world, just like she was in the real world. Her body was like a passport between worlds. There is also proof that tattoos set spiritual experts apart from other people. Shamans and healers frequently exhibited intricate markings that signified their capacity to go back and forth between the seen and the unseen. The tattoos on the Ice Maiden are very detailed, more so than the tattoos on most warriors. This suggests a role based more on knowledge than fighting. The body became text in a culture that didn't have written records. People who could read the language could read the Ice Maiden's story in ink and skin. Even though that language is no longer spoken, the message is still clear. This was a woman whose identity was holy, planned, and meant to last. Her tattoos said what words couldn't. They made it through. The Ice Maiden was not buried in normal clothes. Her clothes were layered, planned, and incredibly well preserved, giving us a rare look at how people dressed in a world where they moved around a lot. In archaeology, textiles usually disappear first, but the permafrost acted like a vault here. Wool, felt, leather, and fur lasted long enough to tell a story as clearly as her tattoos. Her clothes were useful, but they weren't plain. It was made to move, stay warm, and long trips, but made with care and a sense of visual balance. The cuts made it possible to ride and walk on rough ground. The materials were strong and meant to last in harsh weather. But just staying alive doesn't explain the accuracy. These clothes weren't just thrown together. They were made to talk to each other. The color was important. The texture was important. The layers themselves were important. In steppe cultures, clothes were a way to talk to each other. What you wore told people who you were, where you fit in, and how they should treat you. The clothes of the Ice Maiden suggest that she is of high status, not royal in the traditional sense, but respected. maybe even worshipped. Some parts of her clothes are similar to things from the Pazaric culture, which is known for its fine craftsmanship even though it is nomadic. This culture valued balance, animal symbols, and expert sewing. Clothes were not just for looks, it was a mix of protection, identity, and ritual. The shoes found near her body were very important. Well made boots suggest that the person traveled a lot, maybe even long distances on horseback. This person wasn't limited to one camp or home. She changed. She took part. She was part of the fast paced rhythm of life on the move. Even though her headdress is broken, it looks like it was used in a ceremony. In steppe societies, headgear often showed spiritual roles or special events. This, along with her tattoos, suggests that she was more than just an everyday woman. Clothing backed up what ink said. Her clothes were still there when she was buried, remained intact and carefully put together. This was not a mistake. Putting clothes on the dead was a sign of faith. The Scythians got their dead ready to go on living, not to die. The Ice Maiden was dressed to live on after death, just like she had in life, able, respected, and complete. In a culture that didn't have palaces or permanent monuments, clothes became a way to build yourself. The clothes of the Ice Maiden were like her walls, her flags, and her signs of status. Because of the ice, they lived, and so did her location in the world. One thing is clear from the Ice Maiden's burial. She didn't get her power from being comfortable or wealthy. It came from being able to last. The Siberian steppe was a harsh place to live because of the extreme cold, constant movement, and the needs of animals and the land. It wasn't easy to get power in this world. It was shown every day. Her remains show that she lived a life full of stress and strength. Her body shows signs of wear that are normal for someone who rides, travels, and does physical work. This person was not protected from difficulty, no matter what her job was, healer, ritual specialist, or leader. She had to be actively involved in the lives of her people. Here, respect was earned by being useful. Nomadic societies valued people who could do more than the usual. A woman who knew about herbs, sickness, and rituals would have been very important. There was always the danger of illness, injury, and spiritual stress. Someone who could ease pain, read signs, or talk to unseen forces had real power. This kind of power didn't depend on force, it depended on belief. This helps us understand why the Ice Maiden was buried alone, away from other graves. Being buried alone didn't mean being lonely. It was a difference. Some people were set apart in death because they were set apart in life. The work that went into making her tomb, moving the materials, and sealing it in ice shows that everyone agreed that she was very important. This power was not just for show, which is important. There are no weapons next to her, and there are no trophies of victory. Her power was quieter, built into knowledge and faith. In many cultures, spiritual leaders were both feared and respected. They healed, but they also set limits. Because they were so close to the unseen, it was necessary and dangerous to offend them. How old she was when she died is also important. She was neither a child nor an old person. She died as an adult, probably while still doing her job. This makes me wonder, was her death unexpected? Was it because of illness, a ritual, or fate? The care taken in burial shows respect, not haste. No matter what happened, it wasn't. Not caring. At that time, the Ice Maiden's power was based on the situation and the people who lived with her people, traveled with them, and went through what they did. That common experience made her real. In a society where survival depended on working together, this kind of legitimacy was more important than any title. Her life shows us that leaders don't always sit on thrones. Sometimes it rides through snow, carries knowledge instead of weapons, and leaves its mark in memory and ice instead of stone. The way the Ice Maiden was buried tells. We know as much about her death as we do about her life. This was not a quick burial because of fear or a crisis. It was planned, ceremonial, and took a lot of work. The Scythians didn't accidentally save her, they picked it. It was carved into the ground and sealed in a way that let water in and freeze. This was not a mistake. In the Alai region, some burials were planned to use ice as a shield. The people in the community knew the land very well. They knew that frozen, the ground could become a guardian stronger than stone. They put her out of reach of animals, weather, and time by sealing her inside. This means that her body was important for more than just mourning. In numerous nomadic belief systems, the corporeal form maintained spiritual importance post mortem. Keeping it safe was a way to keep things in balance. If she was a healer or a ritual expert, people might have thought that her body was dangerous to touch or strong enough to need to be kept safe. Ice was the safest because it was neutral and eternal. Boundary. The grave goods support this idea. The things that were put with her were not too many, but they were important. They show how useful something is, not how rich someone is. This wasn't a show of power meant to scare off competitors. It was getting ready. She was getting ready, not being praised. That difference is important. There is also the issue of what caused it. Her body has signs of illness, possibly cancer, and injuries that look like they have been there for a long time. It wasn't a peaceful death from old age, but it wasn't seen as a failure either. The illness did not get better. Her value, it may have only made her spiritual authority stronger. Many ancient cultures thought that suffering brought people closer to the unseen. The fact that she was buried alone shows both respect and caution. To keep their power from affecting the living too much, powerful people were often buried separately. This was not being sent away. It was a mix of respect and fear. The ice did more than keep the flesh fresh. It kept the intent. Nothing rotted, so every choice her community made is still clear. Their beliefs, priorities, and care are frozen with her. The Ice Maiden did not go away when she died. It changed what she did. She went from being a guide for the living to being a part of the landscape itself. The mountain became a sign for her. The cold protected her. The earth did not lose her. It was her job to take care of her. The shock of the Ice Maiden coming out of the frozen ground in the modern era was felt by more than just archaeologists. Her rediscovery changed what people thought scientific, cultural, and emotional about the world of nomads in the past. This was not an old thing that had been broken up into pieces. This was a woman whose face, skin, and markings were almost directly in front of the present. The past was no longer a mystery. It was about me. The find was new and exciting for researchers. Permafrost preservation showed things that would have been lost forever. How to make clothes, how to do tattoos, health problems, and how to bury someone. The whole academic debate changed overnight. The notion that nomadic cultures were primitive or unrefined became not possible to defend. Here was proof that one person could have medical knowledge, artistic skill, and a complicated spiritual system. But the response didn't stop with science. The removal of the Ice Maiden caused a lot of anger and sadness among the local descendants of steppe cultures. They didn't study her, she was a relative. Some people thought that her disturbance was a violation, a break in a balance that had been carefully kept for hundreds of years. Sickness, accidents, and bad luck were. Later blamed her for being displaced. The emotional response was real, whether it was a coincidence or a belief. This fight showed that there is a deeper conflict between modern knowledge and ancient respect. Archaeology looks for answers by digging things up. Indigenous memory strives for continuity through the preservation of the undisturbed. The Ice Maiden was at the center of this fight, silent, frozen, and unable to stop her second disruption. Museums put her remains on display behind glass, where the temperature was controlled and the items were labeled. Visitors were amazed. Pain, interest, she became famous without her permission, going from a holy person to a global spectacle. But even in this situation, she fought against being objectified. People had to figure out what her tattoos meant. Her posture showed that she meant to do something. Her presence made the idea that time makes things farther apart less certain. In the end, pressure from local communities led to a partial solution. People tried to bury her remains closer to where she had been buried before, which gave her some respect back. The argument didn't go away. It changed. She was more than just a find now. She was a reminder that the past is not a safe place. The rediscovery of the Ice Maiden made archaeology face a question it doesn't often deal with directly. Who has the dead? The scientists who find them or the people who remember them? There is no easy answer. The Ice Maiden changed the world around her once more, not by doing something, but by being there. Even though she hadn't said anything in 2,000 years, she still had the power to upset, question, and demand respect. The Ice Maiden showed more than just one life frozen in time. She made historians rethink a whole world that had been misunderstood for a long time. For hundreds of years, people thought that the nomadic cultures of the Eurasian steppe were on the fringes, violent, primitive, and dependent on settled civilizations for their ideas. The Ice Maiden quietly broke that story down. Her body showed that she knew a lot about medicine, art, and how to think symbolically. The tattoos alone needed knowledge of anatomy, a steady hand, and planning for the long term. Her clothes showed that she was an expert at making textiles that could withstand harsh conditions. Her burials showed that she was intentionally involved with the landscape, climate, and her beliefs. None of this fits the stereotype of a society that is simple or rude. Most importantly, she changed how historians thought about women in these cultures. Before she found out, powerful women among the steppe people were often thought of as myths or exceptions. The Ice Maiden showed that this was not true. She showed that power, spiritual influence, and, in nomadic societies, gender did not limit public presence. Function, not formality, came first in power. She also made it hard to tell the difference between spiritual and political leadership. In stable societies, those roles were frequently distinct. They were similar in some ways to the steppe cultures. A woman who knew about rituals, healing, and symbols could be just as powerful as any warrior. The Ice Maiden was a perfect example of this integration. Her life shows that leadership should be based on knowledge instead of power. Her preservation changed the way things were done too. Archaeologists had to think about how much information is lost when organic material breaks down. Many parts of ancient life, like color, texture, and expression, are lost. The Ice Maiden reminded scholars that what is left is often only a small part of what was there before. History is incomplete, not due to the simplicity of individuals, but because evidence seldom persists. She also had an effect on the public's imagination. She was easier to relate to than kings and generals. You could see her humanity. Visitors did not see someone who had won, they saw someone. This emotional connection changed how people interacted with ancient history, making it less about ideas and more about real life. In this way, the Ice Maiden became a bridge. She linked modern observers to a lost world, not through texts or monuments, but by being there. She made the past feel close. The effects of what she did are still spreading. Her shadow is now present in every new study of nomadic cultures. Every assertion of simplicity must face her proof. She didn't say anything, but she set the record straight after hundreds of years of confusion. What she said didn't change history. It changed because she proved it by living through it. The Ice Maiden's greatest strength is that she won't go away. Civilizations come and go, languages die, and whole ways of life fade away. But she lived on, not as a story or a myth, but as a real person. It wasn't a sign of her survival. It was physical, which makes it impossible to ignore her. She shows a kind of historical honesty that you don't often find in written sources. There is no court poet making her actions sound better than they are, and there is no chronicler changing her story to fit politics. What we see is what is left. Her body, her tattoos, her decisions, and the love her people gave her. These truths are not carved into stone, but into flesh and ice. The Ice Maiden also makes us question what we think is important. She was not an empress. She didn't lead any armies. If she ever had a name that people outside of her tribe knew, it is now lost. But today, her power is as great as that of famous rulers. Why? because she represents lived authority, which comes from knowledge, strength, and trust instead of a chain of command. She makes modern audiences face an uncomfortable truth. History has often remembered the loudest, not the most important. A lot of people like her disappeared without a trace because their worlds didn't write. Yes, the Ice Maiden lived by chance, but also because her people thought she was important enough to protect forever. There is. That choice was very human. They didn't know that she would be found. They didn't keep her for fame. They kept her alive because they thought she should stay whole. That belief has lasted for hundreds of years. When people see her picture or read about her life today, they don't just think about it in an academic way. It makes me feel things. She turns to look at us. She reminds us that people who lived a long time ago were real people with bodies, identities, fears, and goals. The ice. Maiden does not provide comfort. She is there. She shows that cities aren't the only places where things are complicated, and power doesn't have to last forever. A woman from a mobile world, without monuments or writing, changed how history sees her culture just by living. Her people buried her so they would remember her. She was kept so that she could last. And against all odds, she did it. The ice let her rest. Time did not erase her. Stoicism did not originate as an abstract framework conceived in ease. It started with failure. Zeno of Citium, the man who started it, was not a rich scholar or a sheltered intellectual. He was a businessman whose life fell apart to us in an instant. Zeno survived a shipwreck while moving goods across the Mediterranean. The shipwreck destroyed his cargo, his wealth, and the future he had planned for himself. When he washed up on the beach in Athens, he was alive, but had lost almost everything that made him who he was. This moment is important because Stoicism comes directly from that experience. Zeno didn't ask how to get back what he lost. He asked a more important question. If everything outside can disappear without warning, what can a person trust? The answer he started to come up with was very different from what people thought at the time. Not gods, not luck, not status, but a disciplined mind. Athens didn't feel sorry for Zeno. There were many different schools of thought in the city, each promising a different kind of happiness or truth. But most of them were made for people who had money, free time, or power in politics. Zeno was an outsider who was born in another country and lost all his money his way of thinking would. Show that point of view. Stoicism was not about getting away from the world, but about putting up with it. At its heart, Stoicism said that there is a clear line between what we can and can't control. The second group includes money, reputation, health, and even life itself. The first group includes judgment, intention, and moral character. Zeno understood that pain does not come from the events themselves, but from how we see them. When you lose everything, you feel hopeless, unless one's sense of self was never firmly established. This idea was quietly revolutionary from the start. Honor, public recognition, and success outside of Greece were very important to Greek culture. Stoicism questioned that whole set of values. It said that a person who loses everything can still live well if their inner life stays in order. Calm was no longer a gift from the gods. It turned into a skill. In Stoicism, Zeno's shipwreck was not seen as a tragedy, but as evidence that life is not stable, evidence that anticipation engenders suffering, evidence that resilience must be intrinsic. Otherwise, it will falter under scrutiny. Stoicism did not originate in theory, but rather in necessity. It was shaped by loss, made sharper by realism, and focused on clarity. It offered something unique from the start, a way to stay mentally strong in a world where nothing is certain. Zeno didn't go to a private school or hang out with only the best students. Instead, he decided to teach outside under the painted columns of the Stoa Pochile, which is a public walkway in the middle of Athens. This option defined Stoicism as much as its ideas did. The philosophy was not intended for an exclusive group. It was for anyone who lived a life that was open to the public and unpredictable, which was almost everyone. There was a lot of noise at the Stour. Zeno taught in the middle of noise, distraction, and disagreement, while merchants came and went, politicians fought, soldiers came back from war, and slaves did errands. This was done on purpose. Stoicism was not meant to only work in silence. It was supposed to be put to the test in real life, with temptation, insult, and not knowing. Zeno rejected the idea that philosophy was separate from everyday life by teaching in public. Stoicism was not about being smart or winning arguments. It was about figuring out how to react when someone insults, disappoints, ignores, or hurts you. The question was never, "What do you know?" Instead, it was, "How do you act when things go wrong?" This setting also shaped Stoic ethics because Stoicism was about everyday life. It emphasized practical virtues, self control, fairness, courage, and clear judgment. These weren't just ideas, they were tools. A Stoic was expected to use philosophy while running a household, serving in government, living in poverty, or facing exile. The fact that Stoics were public figures also supported one of Stoicism's main ideas, that people are social by nature. The goal was not to withdraw from society, but to participate. Stoics believed that having a clear mind made a person more useful to others, not less. Emotional discipline was not coldness, it was reliability. Teaching in the storied philosophy of prestige was important. Anyone could listen, anyone could challenge. Wisdom was not guarded by rank. This egalitarian aspect helped Stoicism spread far beyond Athens. It spoke to people who felt powerless in rigid social hierarchies. The Stoa itself became symbolic. Its painted walls depicted historical battles and moral scenes, reminders of chaos, ambition, and consequence. Stoicism grew beneath these images, offering a counter we. The idea that while the world remains, life is unstable, but your response doesn't have to be. Stoicism made a quiet promise by getting involved in public life instead of running away from it. You don't need perfect conditions to live well. You need discipline, clarity, and the courage to practice philosophy where life actually happens. As Stoicism grew beyond its founder, it became more and more clear about what it was really about: the inner life. Thinkers like Clenthi and later Chrysippus turned Stoic ideas into a strict system with one goal: mental clarity, not happiness in the sense of pleasure, but steadiness, a mind that does not break under pressure. Stoics believed that the human mind is always making sense of things. An insult is not painful by nature. Loss is not unbearable by default. What causes suffering is the judgment that something should not have happened. Stoicism focused on retraining this habit of judgment. The world is not obligated to align with desire. Expecting it to do so is the root of distress. This did not mean emotional numbness. Stoics felt fear, grief, and frustration like anyone else. What they rejected was being ruled by these emotions. Discipline meant noticing a feeling, understanding its cause, and choosing how to respond rather than reacting blindly. The goal was not to suppress emotion, but to prevent it from hijacking reason. Central to this was the concept of assent. Every impression that enters the mind asks for agreement. The Stoic learns to pause before granting it. Just because something appears threatening does not mean it is. Just because something feels unbearable does not mean it truly is. Mental clarity emerges in that pause. To train this skill, Stoics practiced daily mental exercises. They imagined loss in advance, not to dwell on fear, but to reduce shock when hardship arrived. They reflected each evening on their actions, not to feel guilt, but to improve judgment. Life became a kind of training ground rather than a series of surprises. This inner discipline was considered freedom. A person enslaved by impulse, craving, or panic was not free, even for the rich or powerful. A person who could stay calm in danger or poverty had something stronger than outside control. Stoicism redefined freedom as self governance. This discipline was not meant to separate a person from life. Rather, it made engagement possible without collapse. A Stoic could love deeply, serve loyally, and act decisively because their stability did not depend on outcomes. In a chaotic world, Stoicism offered a quiet but demanding promise. Clarity is not something that is given, it is something that is practiced, and the mind is always the battlefield. Stoicism did not stop at personal psychology. It made a much bigger claim about reality itself. The universe, Stoics said, is not random chaos. It is governed by logos, a rational, ordered principle that shapes everything from the movement of stars to the unfolding of human lives. To live well, then, was not to fight reality, but to understand it. For Stoics, fate was not a blind force or cruel destiny. It was the natural consequence of cause and effect, stretching back endlessly. Every event had reasons behind it, even if those reasons were beyond human comprehension. Suffering came not from fate itself, but from resisting it. The famous Stoic metaphor compared life to a dog tied to a moving cart. The cart will move regardless, The dog can walk willingly or be dragged. This worldview demanded humility. Humans were not the center of existence. They were parts of a much larger system, expecting the universe to bend to. Personal desire was irrational. Mental clarity emerged from aligning one's will with reality as it exists, rather than as one desires it to be. However, this did not equate to a passive form of fatalism. Stoics maintained that effort was not futile. Rather, they posited that human reason is an integral component of the cosmic order. Acting virtuously constituted the appropriate engagement with the universe. While outcomes could not be controlled, intentions could be, thereby preserving responsibility without delusion. This concept transformed the Stoic perspective. Misfortune, illness, exile, poverty, and death were not punishments. They were natural events within a rational system. To label them bad was to confuse discomfort with moral failure. Virtue alone was truly good. Vice alone was truly harmful. Everything else was neutral material to work with. This perspective created a remarkable calm in extreme circumstances. If the universe operates according to reason, then panic is unnecessary. One's task is simply to respond well to whatever arrives. This does not eliminate pain, but it removes anger. Reality is no longer an enemy. Importantly, Stoics did not claim to fully understand fate. They accepted mystery. The demand was not comprehension, but cooperation. Accept what cannot be changed. Act well where choice exists. Mental clarity lives in knowing the difference. This cosmic framework also supported compassion. If everyone is shaped by causes beyond their control, then cruelty makes little sense. Error comes from ignorance, not evil intent. Understanding replaces hatred. Patience replaces resentment. Stoicism's view of fate offered something rare: peace without denial. The world remains harsh. Loss still occurs, but meaning is not destroyed by hardship. It is revealed by how one meets it. To the Stoic, clarity begins when resistance ends. Stoicism might have been born in Greece, but it matured in Rome. When the philosophy crossed into the Roman world, it encountered a culture obsessed with duty, hierarchy, power, and endurance. Instead of clashing, Stoicism adapted and thrived. Its emphasis on discipline, self control, and responsibility were in line with Roman values, especially for those in charge. Roman Stoicism was more about putting ideas into action than coming up with new ones. Statesmen, generals, and administrators weren't asking how the universe worked in abstract terms. They were asking how to stay steady while ruling provinces, leading armies, or surviving political chaos. Stoicism had an answer: control the self, and everything else will fall into place. One of the first and most important Roman Stoics was Seneca the Younger, a man who lived at the heart of imperial power while constantly warning against it. Seneca was wealthy, politically entangled, and perpetually at risk. His writings focus obsessively on time, anger, fear, and death, not as philosophical curiosities, but as daily threats. For him, Stoicism was survival training for life near the throne. Stoicism also appealed to those with no power at all. Epictetus, born enslaved, taught that freedom had nothing to do with legal status. A person could be chained and still free as long as their judgments weren't controlled by fear or desire. This idea was very radical in a society based on strict hierarchy. It said that authority couldn't give or take away inner freedom. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who ruled the most powerful state on earth, is perhaps the best example of Roman Stoicism. He wrote his works as exercises in humility, restraint, and clarity, not to be published. To himself, while surrounded by war, disease, and responsibility. In Rome, Stoicism became less a school and more a mindset. It was practiced by people who could not afford emotional collapse. It taught them how to endure success without arrogance and failure without despair. What Rome gave Stoicism was realism. What Stoicism gave Rome was restraint. Together they produced one of history's most enduring philosophies of mental clarity under pressure. Stoicism survived because it was never meant to. Stay theoretical. From its earliest days, it insisted on practice, repeated, deliberate, and often uncomfortable. Philosophy for a Stoic was not something you admired, it was something you trained like the body or a craft. Without practice, clarity dissolved under pressure. Stoics treated each day as a kind of exercise. Morning reflection prepared the mind for difficulty ahead. One would anticipate irritation, insult, delay, loss, not pessimistically, but realistically. By expecting friction, the Stoic reduced its power to shock. Nothing that arrived felt unfair because nothing was unexpected. Mental clarity begins before events occur. Equally important was evening review. At the end of the day, Stoics examined their actions without self hatred or excuse. Where did emotion override reason? Where did impatience appear? Where was restraint successful? This was not confession, it was calibration. The goal was improvement, not punishment. Another core practice was voluntary discomfort. Stoics would occasionally eat plain food, wear rough clothes, or sleep without comfort, not out of self denial, but to weaken fear of loss. If you can tolerate little, you are not enslaved by abundance. Luxury becomes optional rather than necessary. This practice directly attacked anxiety about the future. Language itself became a tool. Stoics trained themselves to describe events accurately rather than emotionally. A betrayal became someone acted according to their understanding, not I was wronged. Illness became the body is impaired, not this is unbearable. By stripping away exaggerated language, the mind regained proportion. Attention to the present moment was another discipline. Stoics warned against living mentally in imagined futures or replayed pasts. Anxiety lived ahead. Regret lived behind. Clarity lived only in what could be acted upon now. This was not mystical presence, but practical focus. Importantly, Stoic practice was never solitary self improvement for its own sake. The end goal was ethical action. A clear mind allowed fair judgment. Emotional restraint enabled patience with others. Discipline made one reliable in crisis. Stoicism was not about inner peace divorced from responsibility. It was about becoming useful. This practical orientation explains Stoicism's endurance. Empires fell, institutions changed, but the need for steadiness under pressure did not. Stoic exercises required no special tools, no retreat, no authority, only attention and effort. In this way, Stoicism functioned less like a philosophy and more like mental training, not something to agree with, but something to live one disciplined day at a time. Stoicism did not vanish with the decline of Rome. Instead, it quietly passed into a new intellectual world, reshaped rather than rejected. As Christianity spread across the Mediterranean, early Christian thinkers encountered Stoic ideas everywhere in education, rhetoric, and moral language. They disagreed with Stoic theology, but found its psychological discipline impossible to ignore. Early Christian monks, especially those people who lived in the deserts of Egypt and Syria, had to deal with a problem that Stoics had been dealing with for hundreds of years: how to control the mind. Being alone didn't help. It made fear, anger, lust, and despair worse. The chaos inside was often worse than the chaos outside. Stoic techniques offered solutions. Figures like Evagrius Ponticus came up with systems for keeping an eye on thoughts that are very similar to Stoic psychology. He taught that disturbing thoughts come uninvited and must be looked at before being accepted. To the Stoic idea of withholding assent, temptation was not sin, agreement was. Christian asceticism adopted Stoic emotional discipline while redirecting its goal. Where Stoics sought alignment with reason and nature, monks sought alignment with God. But the methods overlapped: attention to thought, control of desire, acceptance of hardship, and focus on inner stability. Stoic language also shaped Christian moral teaching. The emphasis on patience, endurance, humility, and self control echoed Stoic virtues almost directly. The idea of not caring about outside status took on a new meaning when Christians rejected worldly honor. Wealth, reputation, and power were seen as distractions rather than accomplishments. Christianity also softened the harshness of Stoicism. While Stoics often sought emotional invulnerability, Christian thinkers accepted grief, compassion, and vulnerability, but still warned against being ruled by them. The goal changed from self sufficiency to inner obedience, but discipline stayed the same. Main. This fusion kept Stoicism alive during a time when many pagan schools were completely wiped out. Even though temples closed and schools of thought fell apart, Stoic practices lived on in monasteries, sermons, and lessons on morality. The name went away. The method lasted: restraint, acceptance of suffering, and mastery of judgment led to mental clarity and became Christian virtues. Even when people forgot where Stoicism came from, it didn't change. It was taken in. By the time Europe entered the Middle Ages, few thought of Zeno or the Stoa, but the Stoic mind was still working, watching thoughts, fighting urges, and trying to find peace in a hard world. Stoicism didn't need to stay alive as a name. It was strong enough to live on without one. Long before it became popular again, Stoicism came back not through temples or schools, but through psychology. Its fundamental insights subtly resurfaced in contemporary mental health methodologies. The notion that suffering is influenced more by interpretation than by events re-emerged in. Language for therapy without any old metaphysics, but still works. Contemporary cognitive theories resonate with a previously radical Stoic assertion. Thoughts are not the same as facts. Judgment, not circumstance, causes emotional distress. You can get back to being clear by finding and fixing distorted thoughts. This is how Stoicism is put into practice in the clinic. The names of the techniques changed, the mechanism stayed the same. After a lot of trauma, Stoicism also became relevant again. War, being forced to leave home, and totalitarian violence compelled contemporary thinkers to pose the same inquiry that Zeno once articulated. What is left when everything outside is taken? Viktor Frankl was one of the most powerful modern voices to answer that question. Frankl, who had survived the concentration camps, said that meaning, not comfort, was the key to psychological survival. His conclusions are almost exactly like those of Stoicism. He said that freedom is the space between stimulus and response. In pop culture, Stoicism came back as a balance to too much stimulation and emotion. In a time of anger, comparison, and worry, its insistence on self control and restraint felt almost rebellious. Stoicism didn't promise happiness, it promised strength. That difference was important. Modern self help often takes ideas from Stoicism but leaves out the moral core. People use techniques to be more productive, feel more confident, or deal with stress, but classical Stoicism was never just about getting the best results. It linked mental clarity to virtue, honesty, and fairness. Bravery and accountability. People thought that being clear without morals was dangerous. This tension is what makes Stoicism popular again today. People like it because it is calm, but they often think it means hiding your feelings. In reality, Stoicism requires emotional awareness rather than denial. It asks you to deal with reality as it is, without any tricks or drama. Nostalgia for the past is not what keeps Stoicism alive. It matters. The world is still not stable. Loss is still unavoidable. Attention is still split up. Stoicism gives you a way to stay strong in the face of instability without pretending it will go away. Its appeal today is the same as it was in ancient Greece and imperial Rome. How to live well when you can't be sure. The same question in different centuries. Stoicism keeps answering in a calm, steady way, with no promise of comfort. Stoicism lasts because it never promised to get away. It promised to be clear. The same things happened every time it came back. Uncertainty, loss, noise, and stress. Stoicism does not seek to eradicate these forces. It shows you how to deal with them without breaking. At its core, Stoicism changes the way we think about strength. Being strong doesn't mean being in charge, being very emotional, or always being sure of yourself. It's the ability to stay calm when things get worse. It is not letting fear, anger, or desire control what you do. This kind of strength is not loud. It doesn't say anything, but it stays. In the Stoic sense, mental clarity is not a state of calm that lasts forever. It is the act of aligning, the alignment of judgment with reality, values with behavior, and desires with acceptance. The mind breaks when these two things don't agree. When they are in line, resilience comes out. Stoicism also puts responsibility back where it belongs, not on fate, not on other people, not on situations, but on judgment. This is hard. It takes away the comfort of blame, but gives back the ability to act. If distress comes from how you interpret things, then discipline can help you understand them better. The world. The outside world may still be harsh, but the inside response can get better. This is why Stoicism can't be simplified. It is not thinking positively. It doesn't promote hope for its own sake. It wants realism and self control. It recognizes pain without making it worse. It lets you be sad without giving up your mind. It accepts things that don't last without giving up. In a culture that often sees showing emotions as being real, Stoicism can seem cold, but it doesn't want to erase emotions. It is emotional. It is okay to feel what is right for as long as it is helpful, but don't let feeling become who you are. What Stoicism ultimately provides is not happiness, but dependability. People can count on a stoic person in times of trouble, not because they don't feel anything, but because they aren't overwhelmed. This is why the philosophy was interesting to rulers, slaves, monks, soldiers, and survivors. Different lives, same need. Stoicism does not guarantee fairness in life. It promises that there is a way to be clear. That is its power that is quiet. 2,000 years after it was born, Stoicism is still the same as it was back then. A way of thinking for people who can't afford to live in a fantasy world but still want to do well. Burial mound, expecting to find only broken tools and bones that were scattered around. Instead, they found something that made them very uneasy: a woman who was perfectly preserved by ice, as if time had stopped. She was lying in a wooden room that was sealed off by permafrost. Her body was carefully wrapped and surrounded by things that had been put there on purpose. The cold did what embalming couldn't. It completely stopped the decay. Her skin was still fine. Her hair was still stuck to her head. Even the soft fabrics of her clothes stayed intact.